Hey, I think we've given everybody enough time, so let's get started. Um, so, First of all, a little bit of housekeeping. We have muted everybody except me and David, who will be speaking. And If you have questions, David would like to leave them till the end, but you can write them in the chat, and then I will ask David those questions, as many as we have time for, at the end of the session. So before we get started with that, first of all, welcome everybody. Welcome to Hob. If you haven't been at a Hob event before, there seem to be quite a few new faces. I hope you'll find this evening's talk and the discussion that we have afterwards, they'll be interesting and useful, and maybe even you'll stick with us for a few more events. So I'll just let you know a little bit about what we've got coming up. The next event we have is our annual barbecue on July 25th, which will be in Bet Shemesh, hosted by Sharon and Martin Rhodes. I don't know if they're here. I didn't see their names separately, but maybe they're in one of those rooms with lots of people. So this year is special because we'll also be celebrating the anniversary of this incarnation of Hob Rehovot. It will be our 30th anniversary. So we thought that was quite special and worth celebrating. So that's July 25th. And then on August the 22nd, we have Dr. Helen Fry speaking to us on Zoom about her latest book, which is Women in Intelligence, The Hidden History of Two World Wars, which apparently reveals the pivotal role of British women across the first half of the 20th century. So that should also be very interesting. And we've had Helen before, and she's also a very good speaker. So that's what's coming up. So now I'd like to introduce David Newman. I think some of you might be less familiar with David and his work than others. So I'm just going to mention a few things. First, the most important things, which are those that he told me he wanted me to say. He's lived in Israel since 1982 with his wife Elaine, who's also an ex-Londoner. They live in Meitar. He says he is a Fabrent Tottenham supporter. As you'll hear, he spent most of his career at Ben Gurion University, among other things, but he is going to be retiring this year. So here's a bit more about his work. Professor David Newman has both undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in geography from Britain. And that's how he started his career in Israel, lecturing in geography. But then he went to Ben Gurion University, and in 1988, he founded their Department of Politics and Government and served as its chairman for the first 5 years after that. And since then, he's continued teaching and writing and educating on politics and geopolitics until today. In 2013, he was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire. That's an OBE, anyone who didn't realize, in the birthday honours for services to higher education and the humanities, and for promoting academic links between the UK and Israel. So he's actually grossly overqualified to talk about today's topic. I think with that, I'll pass on to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much. In a minute, I'll be putting on a PowerPoint on the share, so you'll be able to see that on the screen instead of my face. I'm speaking to you from my home in Meitar, south of Israel, north of Beersheba. When you sent me that brief bio, just check it was correct. I must have missed something. Actually, the politics department was founded in 98, not 88. And the few personal remarks should have come at the end, not at the beginning, although I do agree they're the most important ones.
Sorry about that.
Having said that, it's nice to be with you this evening. I don't know if I'm overqualified to speak about this topic because Yes, I'm a professor of geopolitics, politics, and government, and a lecturer going through his or her life every year or every few years, you're asked to give just another course on the side, not your real interests and focus. And my foci have always been geopolitics and borders. And as some of you may know, the last few years, I developed a whole new research interest into Anglo-Jewish history, which I'm going to take up even more strongly once I retire in a few months' time. Some of you may be familiar with the Synagogues of the UK Facebook site I run. And I think I may even have spoken to you about an Anglo-Jewish heritage or synagogue topic in the past. So my memory serves me. And occasionally one of those courses, every few years, until recently, I would teach a course on comparative electoral politics or comparative electoral systems around the world, looking and discussing with undergraduate students how the different election systems work, because the Israeli students are all used to the Israeli system, and they're not quite sure if that's what happens all around the world, how it works elsewhere. And I've always been very fortunate that the two systems that I know best, having grown up in the UK and having lived in Israel most of my adult life, are in fact the two ends of the continuum. You couldn't have two more opposite systems, with most other electoral systems sitting somewhere in the middle of the continuum. And I know we have a tendency to complain and say in Israel, well, it's too many small parties and too fragmentary, which it is. But every electoral system has its good and bad points. And I wouldn't necessarily say that Israel is a terrible system. It needs improvement, but so too does the British system, which is not a very proportional, not a very democratic system, if you can use that term. So both Britain and Israel are good case studies to look at these things from. So after that brief introduction, I'm going to put on my share. Can any one of you just nod to say that you're seeing that? You're seeing that? Okay, great. So that's the advert for tonight. And what I'd like to do over, say, 40, 45 minutes, maybe a bit longer, is talk around three topics. I want just for the first 5 or 10 minutes to be a bit academic and say something about overseas voting in different countries in the world. It's different in Israel, Great Britain, and the USA. Then, of course, the reason why this discussion has come up is because, number one, there's UK elections in just a few weeks' time, on the 4th of July, American Independence Day, my birthday. They always make great birthday parties for me in America. And, of course, the change in the laws, and more people have become interested in the idea or the possibility of, despite the fact they live in Israel or they live many other places around the world, of participating in that election system. And those of you who are interested, then you just have to go onto the British electoral. I think actually Steve sent out the link to how you do it. It's too late to actually send a vote in. I think you have to appoint a proxy in England, something like that. And then at the end, actually talk about the larger part. Let's say some of you are considering voting, some of you aren't. Why are you doing that, and what are the main considerations you are thinking of? What reasons would you or would you not vote in the British elections, assuming that you're all residents of Israel, and probably most of you long-term residents of Israel as well? As some of you may have seen on one of this has just started as I started speaking. Some of you may have seen yesterday on one of the British Israel politics Jewish community sites, I sent round a straw poll saying, I'm going to speak on this topic tonight. I'd be very interested if people would write to me privately and tell me whether they do intend or don't intend to vote and what their reasons are. And I've put, I had about just under 30 responses. And I've put 6 or 7 of them together, which when I get to that part, I'll read out. Actually, it's quite interesting the way it goes. So let's just say something very general about electoral systems. Let's not talk about Britain for the moment. Let's talk about Israel and let's talk about the USA. The USA, of course, there are many, many more Americans living in Israel than there are Brits, but not necessarily higher percentage. Au contraire, there's a higher percentage of British olim than American olim in Israel. But of course, given the huge difference in numbers, 6 million American Jews, 250,000 British Jews, in absolute numbers, there are many more Americans. And I'm sure you all have neighbors and friends here who are American. And most of them will tell you that they have to file tax forms every year. They have to, in most cases, not 100%, in most cases by American law, they have to, which is always a big headache for them. And many of them, again, I don't know the percentage, do take part in the elections, the American election when they come around. And as you're all probably aware, both the Republicans and the Democrats have an Israeli office which starts getting into action prior to the American elections, where it signs people up and gets them out to vote. And so in that sense, Americans are much more proactive in taking part in the American elections, overseas vote, than is true certainly of the Brits up until now. And you can see that I'm not going to read all of this out, but it says the right to vote in US federal elections is determined by citizenship, not residence. Little is known about the Americans abroad. And when I come to talking about the number of Brits in Israel who are eligible to vote, I spent quite some time trying to get a reliable figure. I spoke to someone at the embassy. I looked at the Israel Bureau of Statistics census data. I spoke to the JPR in London, the Jewish Policy Research Center, and they all give you slightly different figures. The figures are not that accurate, and that's true actually of most countries, expatriates living abroad, because not all of them necessarily register as former Brits or former Americans or former French. They come in different ways. Some actually come on Aliyah, others come to study and they stay. And then, of course, in the case of Israel, you also have a lot of people who come from Britain, from America, from many places. They come on a gap year, could be to yeshiva. Quite a few thousand American and British citizens, particularly boys, studying in yeshiva here, who are eligible to vote, but whether they do or don't is another question altogether. And people come and stay. So the figures are approximate that I'm going to show you, but it's very hard to be totally accurate about them. Israel is exactly the opposite. If you're an Israeli citizen and you're not in Israel on election day, unless you are a diplomat or an official shlichut, which were all told a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people, if you're an Israeli citizen outside the country, whether you're on holiday, whether you're living abroad, and we know a lot of Israelis live abroad in America, in the UK, in Germany, other places, you cannot vote in Israeli elections, full stop. There have been attempts over the years to change that law with different reasons behind those politicians who have wanted to run. And of course, in the early years, the whole idea was, well, if you're an Israeli and you're leaving Israel, and we still use this concept of yuridah, in a sense, you're deserting the ship with the undertones, why should you have the right to vote? And a lot of Israelis living abroad said, yeah, but we grew up in Israel, we served in the army, we went to the later stage. And in an earlier stage, it was very much a right-wing attempt to get them to vote, because it was considered that the majority of Israelis living abroad, particularly in America, tended to be Likud, or right-of-center voters. And a lot of survey work was done on that topic. But it's never gone through, it never went through. And as of today, you have to be resident in Israel to vote. Of course, El Al has often puts on cheap flights on election day, allowing people to come even from as far as America to vote. Sometimes Tu'udot Zahut, ID numbers of people who are no longer alive turn up, particularly by people coming in on the flights from America. One of the great jokes, take it as you will, about Israeli elections, particularly for religious people, is that Kohanim can't vote in the morning because that's when the dead people come and vote. But nevertheless, in principle, you have to be here physically present and go to the voting booth, which is on your electoral card, to vote. So that's, again, two opposites of the extreme. Britain now, as a result of the recent change in law, which has opened it up, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is getting closer to the American system, whereby anyone who is a British citizen, has been previously resident in the UK at whatever time. It used to be a 15-year limit, but now they've changed that. They've knocked that out under the new law, which came in just a few months ago. Can register if you register in time. I think it must be at the very, I don't know if you've passed the registration time by now, or if it's very close. And even if it is still possible, you can only do it by proxy, of getting someone to vote on your behalf. In the UK, it's far too late to send postal ballot. Interesting, isn't it, that all these sophisticated countries, America, UK, Israel, a few differences in America today, don't allow you to vote, or most of them don't allow you to vote on computer, which would make it so easy. I mean, it would just take a second. And the reason being, not that we don't have the technology, that it's a very simple technology. Think everybody would vote, and within 30 seconds, you'd have the results at the end of the day. But everyone in these countries where there's so many young 16, 17-year-old whiz kids who know their way around computers perfectly, everyone's scared that someone's simply going to break into the system, change the results, knock out votes here, put in votes there. And so the countries have always been a bit reticent about using computer technology, which I believe is not a really difficult technology, to allow that to happen, which of course would also mean that participation rates, which are actually quite low in both Britain and America, are higher in Israel, but they're not as high as they used to be. They've been going down in the last 2 or 3 elections in Israel. Who knows what can happen after the Gaza war? It may bring out more people, but even so, participation rates in America can sometimes be around the 50% of eligible voters. In Britain, maybe it can get up to 60% sometimes of the electorate. When you think that 50% of Americans actually go and vote, that means 25% of Americans vote for the most powerful position, the most powerful person in the world. And they may be voting for someone who's in prison next time round, which would be one of the craziest things you can actually imagine about. Whether you're pro or anti-Trump, you can have your own opinions on that one. But to be able to vote for someone who may yet be sentenced to prison, it sounds just crazy. So participation rates aren't high. If they were done by computer, they could be much higher. But everyone is very scared about the tampering that's going to go on, because every country, particularly Israel, has its 17-year-old whiz kids who would have no problem of finding their way into the system and playing about with it and changing the results. The major changes, I don't need to go into this in great detail, of course, about the two systems. As I say, they're the opposite ends of the extreme. In the UK, we vote in constituencies. We vote for one member constituencies. By the way, most countries have constituencies, have multi-member constituencies, not one member. But actually, both the UK and the USA have one-member constituencies. First past the post, whoever gets the highest number of votes then becomes the member of parliament for that constituency. You don't even have to have more than 50%. Let's say there are 4 candidates in a British constituency, and the top candidate gets 35% of the vote. But if everybody else gets less than him, even though altogether it's much more than 35%, nevertheless, the way the British system works is that whoever gets the most votes gets in. In theory, it's never happened. It's unlikely ever to happen. But in theory, you could imagine a way in which, say, 650 constituencies in Britain, in every constituency, let's say the Conservative member got 35%. He was always the highest member. And in that sense, he could get the Conservatives or the Labour, if it happened to them, could get 100% of the seats with 35% of the vote. It's not going to happen because the country is divided into North and South. There are clear Labour areas, there are clear Conservative areas. That's never going to happen. But that is a problem, and therefore it's a very non-proportional system. It does generally give you greater stability than you have in the Israel case, although in the past 10 years, even that hasn't been so sure in Britain when they've had to do deals with the Liberal Democrats and so on. But of course, the present government in Britain, which came in with a huge majority in 2019 under Boris Johnson, certainly didn't need to do any sort of coalition deal or anything like that, which is very rare in the UK, by the way. And based on the polls that we're reading, it seems to be the opinion that because the Conservatives have made a bit of a mess of their own governance in the last few years, that it could well be taken back by Labour in the next election. We don't know. At the same time, for the Conservatives to lose the next election, the swing would have to be so great. I mean, people were saying 4 years ago, there's no way the Labour are going to get back in power for another 10, 15 years with such a huge majority, because it will take them 2 or 3 elections to chip away at that majority. But the Conservatives have made a bit of a hash up, particularly Boris. According, as I say, I read the newspapers just like you do. And according to many of the polls, Labour are in with a real chance of a big enough swing to take over power next time. As I say, but normally there's a clear majority. It could so happen that the Conservative majority will go down to the extent that it only has maybe 20 or 30 seats more than Labour, and then they may require the Liberal Democrats or the Scottish Nationalists, and now there's a Reform Party, isn't there? I doubt if they'll win any of the constituencies. Much more difficult, almost impossible, for small parties to get into Parliament in Britain because of the constituency system, because you may end up getting 10 or 15% of the vote on a national basis, which is a lot of votes, many million of votes, but you haven't won a single constituency. And that is a bit unfair. I mean, it's non-proportional, but you sacrifice proportionality for what is normal stability. Normally, a British government will run the full 4 years, 5 years, or in its last year will choose the date to go to the electorate. And you don't have the problem that we have in Israel, at least we did until recently, of every 5 elections in 3 years and every 2 years having another election. So on the whole, the British system sacrifices proportionality for greater stability. And there are many analysts and political analysts who will say that's okay. It's a reasonable thing to do, because the alternative is to have the Israeli system. The Israeli system where there are no constituencies. The whole country is a single constituency. You have party lists above a minimum threshold, which has gone up in recent years, but it's still not very high. It's totally proportional, so that if your party gets 7% of the votes, they're going to get between 6 to 8% of the seats. That's really democratic. That's tremendously proportional. No one can argue with that. But of course, the problem is you end up with lots of small parties or even middle parties, and you always have to spend another 3 months wheeling and dealing to get a coalition government together, which has a minimum of 61 seats and 120 Knesset. You are dependent on 4 or 5 smaller parties propping your government up, and they have disproportionate power. They ask for a disproportionate amount of resources, sectoral resources. And so, as I say, you do have great proportionality, but you have a lack of stability in the Israel system. Having said that, this is the first government, although it's the most right-wing government Israel has ever had, this is the first government that has more than just a 1-seat majority. It had 64, even without the war cabinet. There is a right-wing majority at the moment amongst the Israeli public. There was before the Gaza war, no question about that. The left made their own mistakes, particularly the refusal of former Labour Party leader. She was leader until 2 weeks ago. In my view, she should have gone much earlier. Merav Michaeli, in refusing to do a coalition deal with Meretz. Had they done that, then the left of centre would have had another 2 to 4 seats, which would have completely changed the possibility of the type of coalition government you have. That's how close it is. And that's an important point to make when you're thinking about overseas voting, because in a sense, I'll come back to it in a minute, overseas voting can have a much greater impact on the final result in a system like Israel than it does in a system like the UK. One of the questions I'm going to raise at the very end is, okay, so you've decided you're going to vote in the UK, but does it make much difference? And that's an important question. We'll look at some of the constituencies which are relevant right at the very end of this presentation. So they're the two systems. I probably haven't said anything new to you, but it's important to compare them and to understand what overseas voting does in either of these systems. It doesn't look at the moment that Israel is going to change the law to allow people living abroad to vote in the Israeli elections. I'm actually quite happy with that. But a lot of people will argue, well, look, they served in the army for all sorts of reasons to make a living. For other reasons, they went abroad, they've stayed abroad. Why shouldn't they have the right to vote in Israeli elections? And you can make strong arguments either way. As I say, this year, Britain changed its own rules. All abroad, more Brits overseas can now register to vote. If you just look at the opening sentences here, British citizens living abroad are now eligible. It removes the previous 15-year time limit. I assume that applies to many of the people listening in this evening. For whatever reason, I didn't follow the debate beforehand. Britain's decided it wants to encourage more of the Brits living abroad to vote in the UK elections. And they change, I mean, it's a very considerable change. I'm not sure where this figure 3.5 million come from. To vote for 3.5 million people living abroad, that's I think there's a typo there. I think that's the number is far too high. But even so, certainly hundreds of thousands of Brits living abroad. And of course, Israel is just a very small piece of that equation. We're going to get into the discussion as to why people living in Israel would want to vote in the UK. And we're going to look at, obviously, the so-called Jewish stroke Israeli factor, which is a factor which only applies here. Normally, it's going to be about economics, about the way Britain is being governed. Maybe people have got investments. Maybe they own a house in Britain. Maybe they lived for a long time and they only came here when they retired, which is also very different to someone who's been living here for 30, 40 and 50 years. But there's no question that the number of potential eligible voters in this coming UK election from abroad is going to be far, far higher than any previous election. This more or less tells you what the new regulations are. You can register as an overseas voter if you are either a British citizen, an eligible Irish citizen, or registering to vote in Northern Ireland. If you want to vote in England, Scotland, okay, you have to register. Your registration lasts up to 3 years. You'll get a reminder when it's time to renew. In the past 15 years, I've twice been back on sabbatical to the UK, both times living at more or less the same address, Oslo Court in St John's Wood, just in different flats each time. And I sort of became a re-registered person because one was for 2 years, one was for 3 years. And for a while when I came back, although I was traveling every 6 weeks between the two places, but for a while when I came back, I was getting people were telling me, you know, you've got the porter in Oslo Court, who I stay friendly with, to pick up post for me. I was saying, you know, you've got an electoral card coming in. And I just let them pass. And I've noticed in the last year or two, I've no longer been receiving them, which means that my 3 years is now up. So if I wanted to, I'd have to re-register, which, as I'll explain to you at the end, I don't intend to, but some people do. You can vote in UK Parliament elections, referendum. Well, England isn't really a country for referendum, nor is Israel. And we all know what happened in the last referendum. Britain did something called Brexit. I will reserve my opinion on that because I may, many of you may not agree with what I think about the Brexit vote. I personally think it was a terrible thing to vote on in this new global world, but of course not everybody has that opinion. So they're the rules now. I came across in looking some material up for this particular lecture, and you really challenged me because you asked me to talk about this topic. So I had to sort of go searching for material. I came across this very interesting document, which any one of you can go online to the House of Commons and just freely access it and download it. And I've just put in 2 pages here. This was published, as you can see, in January 2024, just a few months ago, but before the elections were called. Oh, in fact, I should add one other point about the comparison between the British and the Israeli system, and that is to say, of course, when Britain decides to go to vote, it dissolves Parliament. The Prime Minister then goes off, I was going to say, see the Queen, see the King. And you normally, 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, elections are held. And normally, I say not always, but normally, the Prime Minister then decides who to give cabinet posts to at Chequers over the weekend. And next Monday, it's back to business. So sometimes it extends, it can be 6 weeks. In Israel, if you dissolve the Knesset, you'll usually work out a date 3 months in advance, or even longer sometimes, but at least 3 months. And you have to work out a date which doesn't clash with a Chag or a Friday. So it's often on a Tuesday in Israel. And as we all know, once the results are out of the Israeli elections, it can take 6 weeks and 2 months and even more until a coalition government is put together, during which time, in other words, from the day you have dissolved the Knesset to the day a new government is sworn in can be almost half a year. And during that period, the government in question is, in a sense, it stays in power. It's not allowed to resign. It's a transitional government, but it's normally accepted that the governments don't take really major decisions during that period. Sort of it keeps the country running. And so the period of time it takes for elections in this country, I think, is inordinately long. And I have, by the way, a lot of positive things to say about the electoral system in Israel, but not about the time it takes us to hold elections. We should be doing it much quicker, and it takes far, far longer. In the United States, you don't have to do anything like that. You know that on the second Tuesday of every 4 years, on the second Tuesday of November, there are presidential elections. And on every 2 years, on the second Tuesday of every November, part of the Congress and part of the House of Representatives are elected. It's very rare for all of them to be elected on one and the same date. So there's a fixed date which never changes. In Britain, you have longer periods, but quick elections. It also means in America, of course, because you know that, in a sense, electoral campaigns, particularly the rivalries for presidency, can go on for up to a year. They're raising money, they're involved in the primaries. So again, all these systems have their quirks, which make them longer or shorter. I think one very commendable thing about the British system is the time it takes to hold the election and to put the new government together, so that limited amount of time and resources and adverts are wasted on that. Okay. How many overseas voters are there for the UK? Well, have a look at this table. The number increased. Until 2015, it was a very small number. And then in 2015, there was an overseas registration campaign when they went around the world trying to drum up support. And as I say, this year, of course, the numbers will shoot up because of it's been made much easier, the rules and the regulations. You can see, of course, the numbers fluctuate up and down. Normally, in the year of an election, people rush to register. And as you move away from an election, so if you look at in 2019, where you had almost 250,000, which isn't, that's, I don't know where that 3.5 million number come from, but where you had about 250,000 people who have registered. Remember, there's so many people eligible to vote. There are only so many of those people who actually register to vote. And I think you'll find in most countries that only a percentage, I mean, it rarely rises above 20-25% of the people eligible to vote. Most people don't tend to vote in the country of their origin, the country they grew up, for all sorts of reasons. You can see the numbers have come down to December 2022, and I'm going to assume that those numbers in the last couple of weeks have moved up. I don't know whether they've come back as much as 250,000. They may well have done, but of course the numbers are going to be much higher at the time of the election, itself. The government estimates that the changes ending the 15-year limit will mean around 3.5 million British nationals living overseas will be eligible to register to vote. How many actually would? Let's say 10% would mean 350,000. I think that would be a top number, but it would be interesting to see how it does actually change. There were just figures about the number of Brits living in the EU, which doesn't really interest us. And of course, that's also probably going to be going down as a result of Brexit. Many people were living in Spain or France. It could be that many are returning to the UK or finding it more difficult living in those countries. And it's very possible in the EU, more people, a higher percentage of expats voted in the UK because they're near home and they're traveling to and from the whole time. It also depends, are these people who are actually living abroad I know many people, in particular amongst the Jewish community, who, if they haven't come to Israel, they have second homes in Portugal, in Spain, and so on. And they're now increasingly living there because they, for all sorts of reasons, they don't like or they don't feel particularly comfortable at the moment in this particular climate, living in the UK. And are they considered as foreign voters or British voters? A lot of these questions are unclear at the moment. So let's come to us. First of all, as I said, it's hard to find the figures. According to this, the best figures I got, which matched each other, were partly sent in to me, very thank you, I don't know whether he's online or not, but by one of the attaches at the British Embassy today, because they keep a check, obviously, on people who register as Brits living in the country, and also by the demographer at the Jewish Policy Research Institute. I found that the census data of Israel was much more difficult to analyze in this respect. I did also look at Aliyah figures, but Aliyah figures aren't necessarily good because number one, it's a flow rather as a rather than a set number of people at any one time. And it's obvious if you're looking at the people who came on Aliyah between 1948 and 1960, most of them are probably no longer alive. So just because there's a certain number who have come on Aliyah over time doesn't mean that they're all alive today in Israel. So the numbers tend, people were throwing out all sorts of numbers at me, but it appears the numbers are much lower. You can see about 22,000. Oh, no, sorry, this was 2008. Sorry, I've got a more updated figure, but it's not that much more. If you look at, okay, sorry, this is a better table. That was a 2008 table, then I came up with this. If you look at this table, which is extracted from the CBS, from the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel, you have, and for the year 2022, 2 years ago, the number of people with British citizenship living in Israel. On the left-hand column, people who were born abroad, in other words, people who have come on Aliyah, and the right-hand column, people who have been born in Israel but are entitled to British citizenship, in other words, mostly the children of those Olim. So that's why the tables aren't exactly identical. On the left hand, when you look at the Olim, so you have 75 plus, and you can see 3.3%, 65 to 74, 3.1%. But of course, for people born in Israel, the age cohorts are that much younger. So it only starts at 55 plus. And if you look at the from 55, from let's say 50 to 55 plus, you only have about 2%. Whereas then that age cohort for people coming on Aliyah, you've got nearly 10%. So you've got to take this into account. But altogether, people holding British citizenship residing in Israel are about 52,000, of whom approximately 25,000 are people who have come to live in Israel after having lived in England. And a similar number, slightly bigger, 28,000, are people who have been born to British citizens in Israel and have British citizenship. And if they are eligible to vote or not, I think the answer is no, they're not, because they've never resided at any point in their life in the UK. I think although it is based on, in America it's based on citizenship, I think even under the new rules, yes, they've put away the 15-year limit, but you still need to have had a British or UK address at one point in your life to be able to register as a voter. So assuming that is correct, we're talking about 25, let's be generous and say there's some mistakes in the statistics. There's potentially between 25 to 30,000 people who could take up their voting rights in Israel to vote in Britain. That's nothing. It's not even a half of an average constituency in the UK, as we'll see in a minute. But nevertheless, they're the sort of figures we're talking about. They're Aliyah figures, they're very problematic. So what are the considerations you take into account when you decide whether to vote in the UK elections? I think clearly one major point is how long you've lived outside the UK. I've lived here, even though I go back to the UK, I've lived here for well over 40 years. I think looking at my audience, that's true of many of you here, and certainly based on the comments that came in yesterday. And, the longer you're away from home, I don't want to call it home, the longer you're away from your original country, probably normally, if it were not for the Jewish Israel factor, normally you would probably think, well, it's not really my thing to vote there, particularly if I don't have bank accounts there anymore, or I don't own a house, or I don't have children. All of these are factors which are taken into consideration. Did you come as a pensioner as a young adult? I came as a young adult. Although I studied in the UK, all my working life has been in Israel. I've brought up children, I've paid taxes, and all this sort of stuff in Israel, not in the UK. So although I feel quite comfortable in the UK, quite at home, I'm a bit of a chameleon in that respect. But nevertheless, you know, my real working life is associated with Israel rather than UK. Do you continue to pay taxes in the UK? That could be a serious consideration, fair enough. Some people have major investments, they may own a house. And if you're paying taxes in the UK, that's a real consideration, because obviously most people vote in a government not based on what their policy is towards a foreign country, but based on what their policy is towards economics, taxation, etc. Where did you educate and bring up your children? And in this particular instance, and we'll come back to it in a minute, does your vote influence a candidate's or party's policy in Israel? Should that be a consideration when you're voting in the UK elections? And I'm sure many of you, all of you, have opinions about that, and will no doubt like to state them at the end of this discussion. Are you generally concerned about the way the UK is going? It's a very different country to what it was 30 years ago. Its demographic, its ethnic composition, in many respects, is very different. And people who were brought up there grew up and say, oh, you know, this isn't the England we were brought up in. This is different. And we need to ensure that it doesn't go any further in this direction, et cetera, et cetera. I had one very interesting response today, one which isn't written here, from someone who lives in Jerusalem, who said, well, you know, on the one hand, I need to vote for Conservatives because the Labour, I consider them to be more anti-Israel, but I really can't vote for a party who has, is it the Uganda or the Somalia policy for immigrants? What is the country they wanted to send the illegal immigrants to? So
Rwanda.
Rwanda, sorry. And so here's a person living in Israel, but he's very concerned about the social context of what's going on in England today. That's an interesting answer, but it's a rare answer. Most people living here don't tend to take those things into account. Here are some of the comments I got in, and you're going to see there's quite a magama, quite a trend. I think it's utterly ridiculous for anyone who doesn't live there to have any right to influence the outcome of the vote. I've never voted in UK elections since we made Aliyah in 1980 because we felt that we did not live or work there, was not right to participate. Now look at the third one. I'm voting now for the first time since leaving solely for Jewish Israeli reasons. The Brits want to tell me about my security, so I'm returning them their favor. I've been in Israel for 20 years. I'm eligible to register with the embassy, but I don't think it's right for me to influence. Even if I could, I wouldn't. What you can see is, and with a few more, well, look at this is different. I'm planning to vote in the forthcoming UK elections because I'm frightened of Labour getting in. Let's just see, US citizens enjoy that. We can exercise our votes can bolster the proportionally low number of Jewish voters and support them in obtaining electoral results is optimal for Jews, both in the UK. Well, I think that's a bit naive to think that your vote really can change the outcome of a constituency. The majority of people who wrote me comments, I've just brought in a few here, have said, I've opted to live in Israel. I don't work there. I don't pay taxes there. There's no reason for me to vote there. There are some, most of the people said they will vote, even if they haven't voted in the past, tend to bring up the Jewish anti-Semitism Israel. I think only one person brought up the fact, I'm going to vote there because I've got economic interest there. And now, so I don't think, therefore, that this is totally reflective of everyone who could have answered, because you don't like to broadcast the fact that, you know, you've got all sorts of nice investments and houses back there in the UK, and that's why you're going to vote. So you probably tend to not answer a poll like this, but nevertheless, the general direction of these comments is very clear. that the majority of people who at least answered took the time to answer. I mean, okay, 30 people altogether tend to have said no. And I think they're mostly people who have lived here for quite a long time as well. So take that into account. What is the Jewish factor? Of course, both are given the last few years. Both party leaders are trying to get their Jewish vote. Historically in the UK, Jews voted for the Labour Party. They were the party of the ethnic minorities, of the immigrants. That changed from about Thatcher onwards, when Thatcher, of course, was in a sense, was the non-Jewish Jew who had come up from a working class background and studied hard and made it good. She brought a lot of Jews into her cabinet. And that's when you tended to see the beginning of a younger generation voting Conservatives. And today that's much more the case, partly because of their policies, but also because of their relative attitudes to particularly to Israel and so on. It's worth noting that when you talk about Israel, the UK's attitudes to Israel, sorry, this is to the Jewish community. Let's stick with the Jewish community for a minute. We'll come to Israel. And of course, both have made it clear, they've made strong statements about that we need to stop this growth in anti-Semitism. We need to fight it. We need to make sure that it doesn't rear its ugly head anymore. Keir Starmer, although he doesn't make a big issue of it, is married to a Jewish woman and is the MP for Hampstead and is quite well known within the Jewish community there. Rishi Sunak is from a family of immigrants. So they both can play that sort of factor to a certain extent. And I think it's fair to say for Sunak and the Conservative governments, obviously the governments have tried, I make the point, the government's tried hard to beat back a lot of this anti-Semitism, but they're clearly not doing enough when you see what's going on in the streets there sometime. One of the most surprising things to have happened, I don't know if you saw this in the news, was that 3 days ago, the president of the Board of Deputies changed. Marie van der Zaal, who's been for the last 6 years, the president of the Board of Deputies, stepped down after 2 tours of office, in which, of course, she was involved a great deal in representing the community on issues of anti-Semitism. A young 38-year-old guy called Phil Rosenberg, I think, is now the new president of the Board of Deputies. He said he grew up in Barnet. That's the shul where my father was a rabbi for 20 years, and where I got married, and I suddenly realized he was born after I left. So that's why I never knew him. But the most amazing thing is 3 days ago, this happened. The day after she stepped down as president of the Board of Deputies, she publicly joined the Labour Party, which has brought a lot of critique. Her husband, Adrian Cohen, has always been, and who's now a new vice president of the Board of Deputies, has always been a member, a very openly Jewish member of the Labour Party. He's fought the good fight, trying to beat down anti-Semitism from within. He and another guy called Andrew Gilbert, who have the London Jewish Forum. They run the London Jewish Forum. So that may be part of it. But of course, that was a very surprising thing to happen just 2 days after she stepped down. And of course, Keir Starmer is going to do a great deal about publicizing this to the extent he can within those constituencies where there are a lot of Jewish voters. We said Jews, let's talk about Israel. Starmer, of course, has a big problem in his party. I think it's fair to say he's brought it back from the depths of the evils of Jeremy Corbyn. If I was living in the constituency, I grew up as a young child in North Islington, Newington Green, if any of you know where that is, Poets Road, Dalston. If I was still living there today, Jeremy Corbyn would be my MP. How lucky. And of course, he's running as, because the Labour Party have now more or less disowned him, he's now running as an independent. And you know what? He's going to get a big vote in Islington. Whether he wins like, excuse for the non-academic expression, but whether he wins like that other crazy Galloway is unclear. But he's going to get a big vote even as an independent in Islington. He may split the Labour votes, which could allow the Conservative in. So it's not clear what's going to happen there. But Starmer has come back, and a lot of the well-known Labour MPs or Labour personalities who were Jewish, who had left the party as a result of Corbyn, have come back to the Labour Party, but not to the same extent. There's no question that today the Jewish vote has moved from Labour to Conservative over a longer period of time. So Sunak, Like all Western governments, they've been critical of Israel's war in the Gaza Strip. But he stands by Israel's right to defend itself. Cameron's been out here a few times, although Cameron has been more critical, former Prime Minister, than Sunak himself. It is worth noting that if you look through the list of British Prime Ministers, going back virtually to Churchill, certainly to Harold Wilson, Labour and Conservative Party, the Prime Ministers have tended to be very warm towards and supportive of Israel. You think of Wilson, Heath maybe less so, but you think of Wilson and you think of Major and Blair, and certainly Theresa May, very, very warm towards Israel. Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, Tony Blair, they've all been very warm towards Israel. The foreign ministers less so in the past. The problem traditionally has been more with the foreign ministry, but that's also changed. But nevertheless, they're aware that this is going to be a factor in a number of constituencies. I found this report from the Religion Media Centre. Among Jews, a strong majority expressed support for this. Is also quite recent, I think about a year ago, for the Conservative Party, 63%, with about a quarter saying they voted Labour. When I was growing up as a kid, and I'm sure many of you will agree with me, because you're my age and maybe even a bit older, Jews didn't vote for the Conservatives. They voted for Labour for the reasons that I said. And if you disagree with me, please say so afterwards. But I know I grew up in the house of an Orthodox rabbi, and the Orthodox tend to be more conservative. Though my father was a great liberal. We read The Guardian at home. And but nevertheless, Labour and some people voted for the Liberal Democrats at that time, because they were sort of great liberals at the time. They may be called the Liberal Democrats today. I don't know if they're particularly liberal in terms of their policies. You can see Jews were evenly split between the main parties as recently as 2010, just before Corbyn came in. But then, of course, voting patterns have swung substantially from Labour to Conservative since then. And so that's changed considerably. And I think that's true of today because, again, of the Israel/Jewish element in this whole debate. And let's end by looking at some particular constituencies, because I would have thought those of you who are going to vote may be from any one of these constituencies. At the end of the day, there are 250,000 Jews in England, in the UK, of which 70% live in North and Northwest London. So we know that there are particular constituencies where there is a stronger Jewish presence. There is no constituency in the UK where there is a Jewish majority of residents in the area. These are the 6 constituencies. 3 of them all next to each other in northwest London: Finchley and Golders Green, Chipping Barnet, Hendon. Hackney and Stoke Newington has a Haredi population of somewhere between 40 and 50,000 today. And that's very significant, but they play local politics in a very different way. They ensured that at least on the Hackney Council, there's always one Labour and one Conservative member so that their interests are preserved. Hertsmere, which of course is a growing Jewish area, Boreham Wood, and all to the north of Edgware and so on. And the one non-London constituency, Bury South, which is Prestwich and Salford, where again there's a very large Jewish population. If you look at all of those constituencies, if you look at all of them, one second, I can't see something here. Let me try and move this up. Oh no, I didn't mean to do that yet. You will see that the average electorate for every one of those constituencies, with the exception of Hackney, which is much larger, is around 70 to 75,000 people. Okay, the total electorate in Finchley, Barnet, Hendon, Hertsmere, and South Bury South, are all around 70 to 75,000. Hackney is larger with 90,000. So the first thing would be to come and say, look, what difference does it make if another, let's say 3,000 or 4,000 people, 5,000, I think that would be a high number, in Israel voted, that he spread over these constituencies. Many of them would anyway have come from other places, Leeds, Liverpool, Birmingham. You know, what difference are they going to make amongst 70,000 voters? If you look at the members, by the way, Mike Freer, great supporter of Israel. I don't know much about Teresa Villiers. Matthew Offord, certainly a great supporter of Israel. Diane Abbott, the less said, the better. And the other two, which is amazing because she represents the constituency of all the Haredim in Stamford Hill. And, you know, the initial reaction would say, well, it doesn't really make much difference. 70,000, 80,000, you know, another couple of hundred votes. Remember, of course, that if 2,000 to 3,000 people living, 4,000 in Israel, think how many may be ex-British Jews living in America or other places may also be voting. Of course, there are going to be people voting from all around the world, but these are the places where most of the Jewish population are going to vote. And yet, though, I came up with another interesting statistic. Look at the results of those same 6 constituents last time round. You look at Chipping Barnett, she won by 1%. You look at Finchley and Golders Green, yes, he had a 7,000 majority, but remember Luciana Berger, who had been a Jewish MP in Liverpool and left the Labour Party, then, in my view, took the mistaken position of running against him in Finchley and Golders Green. She split the Jewish vote, there's no question, when they were both very supportive of Israel. So, okay. Look at Hendon, also 4,000, not a huge difference, if you take into account that in most places in the country, even in these Northwest London Jewish constituencies, there may be a move to Labour for nothing to do with Israel whatsoever, and you add on another few thousand votes, you never know. It could be more significant than at first I was going to say. Hackney is interesting because Diana Abbott has a huge majority. Hackney, and by the way, the Haredim are now becoming a force in Haringey as well, which is the constituency immediately north of Stamford Hill, and they're going down towards Tottenham and that area. So they're playing party politics in Haringey as well. They're more interested in local government politics. That's where they're very active, the Haredim, and they're quite good at it. They're quite sophisticated at it. But I was actually quite surprised. I would have thought that, you know, on the whole, the Haredim tend in national elections to vote Republican or Conservative because they like the Conservative views. They don't like all the postmodern, transgender, all the sort of stuff that is coming up from the left. So they tend to vote in a much more conservative way. So I was a bit surprised at that vote in Hackney, but obviously they could have a certain influence in Hackney. If you think they're 40 to 50,000, of course, many of them, it's such a young population, below electorable age, but they're growing up very quickly, that could change. But you can see that the differences aren't so great. And given the fact that most polls tend to think that Labour are going to have a swing back, so maybe the vote is a bit more significant than I tended to allow it for when I just look at the overall numbers of 70 or 90,000 in a constituency. I'm going to end with a joke. As you can see, I'm not going to tell you whether you should or shouldn't vote. And if you are going to vote, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. That's completely up to you. But I mean, I will tell you quite categorically, I've never voted in the UK since I came here, although I've had the right to. And the reason being nothing to do with Jews and Israelis, because of what many people said. I chose to come here as a young adult to live my adult life here. This is where I've worked, I've paid taxes, I've brought up children, and that's where I think I should be voting. But of course, different people have different ideas. So be interested to hear some of your own perspectives on this. And let's end with a little bit of humor. This joke, you can read it for yourself. And I just added with apologies at the end. Okay, I will stop there and I'll turn off my PowerShare, and I'll be happy to hear your comments or questions. I hope I did justice to a topic which I'm not really a huge professional at, but I enjoyed actually researching it.
So first of all, before we open it up for questions, I'd just like to say thank you very much, David. That was certainly enlightening for me. And you know, you obviously spent a lot of time doing some new research, so I hope that you enjoyed doing that. And it was, and I think everybody will have learned something from it, whether or not they decide to vote on whichever side they decide to vote on, if they do. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have a few questions here before we sort of open it up for general discussion. I think the first one was about why UK elections can be within 6 weeks, but the notice period is much longer here. I think you already answered that, really. And then Stephen Simpson asked, must I vote in the constituency I was living in when I left? Can my proxy vote in their constituency or only in mine? If only in mine, does my proxy have to physically schlep to vote if they don't live in my constituency? Now, actually, I'm not sure if it was Steve or Ellie asked if they could answer that question.
I have to read the regulations. I think it's the last point of formal residence before you left the country.
Yeah, that's how I understood it too. But Steve, you wanted to say something, right?
Yeah. So you have to have registered at least once, and you have to register now as the last place that you were registered
On the electoral roll.
on the last time you were on the electoral roll. So if I went through this process about 2 months ago, I had to tell them where I lived, the postal code. They came back after 2 weeks and said, we can't find you. I said, well, go back to 1974, because that was the last time I voted. And the next day they said, yeah, we found you. So you've got to vote there. Now you can either vote by a postal vote, but that doesn't really work because it takes too long. So you have to have a proxy. The proxy has to vote either in your constituency, which is fine for me because my sister lives in the same constituency that I was in, or they have to get a postal vote for the proxy. So it's got to be a vote. So it is rather limiting.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, and Don just had a comment. You mentioned voting in the US and what changes, and he said that every 2 years in the US, all House representatives and a third of senators are elected. So I think that was a little bit different from what you said. And then Sheila Rose asks this. In a recent by-election, Labour won, but not by an enormous margin. Assuming the votes of ex-British Jews would be in a limited number of constituencies, couldn't it still make a difference?
Well, I think that's what I was trying to show at the end. Could it or couldn't it? Take Hendon, Finchley and Chipping Barnet, which are the main Jewish areas and constituencies where there's a higher percentage of Jewish population, but I don't think in any of them there's a Jewish majority. And anyway, the Jews also are not 100% behind a single candidate. And my initial suggestion was to assume that it wouldn't make a difference because in constituencies of 75,000 people, and in each of those constituencies, maybe you had another few hundred votes. It may not make, but then there may be other people from other places around the world. But again, just because you're voting from abroad doesn't mean you're all voting for the same party as well.
Right.
So given the small margins and the potential swing to Labour, there could have maybe an impact, but I doubt it somehow. I doubt that it would play a major role in the final results. You know that I don't know how many of you know, but the official electoral law in Britain, one of these quaint old things which has never been changed, and I think it's happened twice in British electoral history, is of course that if the final count is very, very close to each other, there has to be a second count. And if the second count, I'm not sure what those numbers have to be, we're talking about tens, and if it's extremely close to each other and there's no result, do you know how it's decided? It's happened twice in British history.
Toss of a coin.
That's right. You throw a coin. You flip a coin. And but I don't think that's going to happen.
Wow. Yeah.
And only in Britain would the Brits accept that. Can you imagine here what would...
Oh my goodness, yeah. Okay, Leslie just wrote that she says, we contacted the electoral people. We are going to vote in person. They've put us back on the electoral roll. So if you have the opportunity to go to England and you want to do that, then apparently that is another possibility.
Expensive reason to go, particularly.
Well, so I don't think that was their reason for going. Don just
right. It's not even season. The football season hasn't even started.
Right, they're going for their daughter's wedding, I believe. They bought tickets, El Al tickets, a few months ago to Heathrow on the 4th of July. So that's so that they're just lucky that it happens to have worked out that way, I think. So
I just add that anyone who is going to vote there, you now have to have ID.
Picture ID.
Picture ID.
Right, yeah. I'm actually also personally, I'm coming back on the 4th of July. I could vote before I come back if I were to contact them, but I'm not planning to do that.
You couldn't. You'd have to stop. You'd have to go to Gatley. You wouldn't be able to get back from Gatley.
Well, anyway. Okay, so that's the end of the questions that people wrote in the chat. Does anybody have any other questions? If you do, if you don't have your video on, please turn it on and raise your hand, or raise your electronic hand. If you know how to do that. No more questions? Oh, Warren, yes.
So yeah, I was going to say, as you say, it's only in a limited number of constituencies that it could make any significant impact. But is that a reason to not vote? After all, if someone votes for a minority party in any of the constituencies, it's still a valid vote.
That's your rightful consider. There are lots of different considerations. Different people have different considerations. Some will say for economic reasons, some will say for Israel-Jewish reasons. As a few people wrote to me and says, I've got the right, so I'm going to vote. And then I said to them, give me a better answer. And two of them said, no, I've got the right, so I'm going to vote. Yeah, I mean, lots of people have different reasons for taking part in that vote.
Thank you.
Somebody on Colin Green's screen has a question.
Hi, my name is David. First of all, David, I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I have a comment. We all are blessed with having come from democracies and therefore taken for granted that we have the right to vote. When my children were growing up, one of the things we used to say to them is that it's really important to go out and exercise your right to vote, because so many people died in order to get that. And in the case of Jews, we had to rely on the emancipation of Jews before we had the right to vote. So I think there's an argument for saying the fact that the electoral system gives us the opportunity to vote, that perhaps we have a duty to do that. We should actually vote, regardless of whether we have an impact or not, because it was a hard-won position.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a fair argument in the country you live in. I mean, I think that people here should vote. In Israel, on the whole, higher percentages do, although, as I say, that's also dropped off considerably in the last 10, 15 years, largely because younger generation is just sick of the way politics is managed and run here. But nevertheless, there is still higher political debate and of course, after what's happening now in Israel, I think that's going to be the case next time round as well. Does that apply to a country that you've left 20, 30 years ago? As I say, I'm not, I raised all the different pros and cons, but people are going to choose different reasons for that. So I'm not going to sort of impose that. I couldn't, even if I wanted to, my reasons for not voting on others. They're all good reasons. They're all legitimate reasons. Well, sorry, just let me say, but I do think that if you're of the opinion that your vote, given the numbers I was talking about, the relatively small number of British voters in Israel, and the size of the constituencies, I think you shouldn't be, if you think that, you know, your vote is going to impact the result, I'm not so sure it's the case. More chance of Israelis abroad impacting the eventual impact here in Israel, because we know just one seat difference can make the difference between a 59 and 61 coalition government here. So actually, Israelis, if they were allowed abroad to vote, and there are a considerable number of Israelis living abroad in percentage terms, there are probably more Israelis living abroad relative to the Israeli population than Britain. I would have to check, but I think that's the case. But if you think, probably Israelis abroad have more chance of influencing the final Israeli vote than of Brits living in Israel influencing the British vote.
Right. Laurette, yes.
Yeah. Just as a matter of interest, how many people here will be actually voting on July the 4th?
Didn't hear that, sorry.
How many people here will actually be voting on July the 4th?
He's asking us to say.
Yes, just a straw poll. Who will be voting? I'm not asking you which way, just asking who will be voting. So not that many. I can't see all the screens, but I can't see all the screens. So.
No, and those people who don't have their screens on, obviously, we don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Just curious.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Warren, you have another question. You're still muted.
Yes. Going back, if a significant number of overseas register for voting, and I'm not talking here from an Israeli point of view, but as a general point of view, will that influence future elections because they will redraw constituency boundaries as a result of large numbers of people?
So it's not going to change significantly the numbers of people. Constituency boundaries are constantly redrawn in the UK. That's something that interests me greatly as a political geographer. And going back 25, 30 years, I was involved in some think tanks in Israel who discussed the possibility of having constituencies in Israel. And we had these sort of workshops working out how would you draw the constituencies here? Would they be single member, multi-member, and how would you draw it? And then, of course, we got involved in the normal Israeli discussion, but you need a constituency for Haredim and a constituency for Bedouin and a constituency for this and a constituency for that. And we worked out at the end of the day, we weren't sure you're going to come out with a very different result to what you get anyway. But constituency boundaries are constantly redrawn in the UK and in America. In America, there's a whole process known as gerrymandering, which is where boundaries are manipulated and people can go to court saying that the way it was done wasn't neutral, but it was done with political motivations. Whereas in the UK, it's a very neutral group of people. Politicians don't take part in the redrawing processes. Every election, there's some constituencies that disappear, some new ones that appear. It's normally because the population has changed considerably. Let's say a whole new town has been built or a whole new neighborhood has been built, or there's a particular constituency where many people have left. It would be interesting. I don't think that the numbers of voters abroad, given the fact also, when you look at all of the British voters abroad, forget about the Jews, who are, of course, the most important, but of the many hundreds of thousands abroad, they're people from all over the country. You know, the Jewish population, as I say, largely been from northwest London, from other places where there's been a Jewish community. But the overall expatriate vote for Britain probably touches absolutely everywhere in the country, and not necessarily the London constituencies, maybe some of the poorer northern areas. So I'm not sure that would have a major impact on the numbers in any particular constituency.
Val, you had a question. And then we'll go back to Colin's room because it's probably somebody different.
Sorry, hang on. It's just a comment on that about, you said that you were talking about constituencies here. Of course, the main problem here is that the MKs have absolutely no accountability to the electorate.
Yes.
That's always been the case. I mean, this is a sort of, I used to be involved in a lot of these discussions about electoral reform. And by the way, one of the interesting things to say, in the 80s, certainly when Chaim Herzog was president, in the 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of discussion going on here about electoral reform. And there was one stage where a whole mixed system was even brought up as far as the Knesset, with Avram Borg and Mordechai Rashubsky pushing it very hard. You know, the idea of a mixed system, which is the most common system, by the way, in the world, where you have a percentage of the seats from a national list and a percentage of the seats from the constituencies. Usually there are more constituency seats than there are national list seats, and there's a topping up process involved. That's what's the most normal electoral system in 80% of countries throughout the world. So they were looking at different ideas of mixed systems here in Israel, where you could have both national lists where sectoral groups would get more seats and the constituencies where there would be regional accountability. But you often heard the argument by people saying, look, what difference does it make in this country? I don't buy into this argument, but it was a strong argument at the time, saying it's a small country, everybody knows everybody. Ariel Sharon is prime minister, and if the mayor of Sderot or the mayor of Kiryat Shmona was in the army with Ariel Sharon, he has direct access to the prime minister, and that's much better than having a local member of parliament. So that was also the argument which was used at the time.
Typically, the argument
there's a huge problem of regional accountability. What's going to happen to the Negev and the North after this war, as most of the, and you also find in this country that most of the Chavrei Knesset who have worked their way up to national government by being local government mayors and so on, many of them, when they get into the Knesset, then move into Tel Aviv or to Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Okay, we're going back to Colin's room again.
Okay. Sorry. There's one big difference between voting in England and here. A vote here can make a difference of one member of parliament of the Knesset, changing not just that the whole map of the whole country.
Absolutely, there's disproportionate power under the Israeli system.
Is in England, the prime minister stays the same prime minister. They're not going to change the whole prime minister because one constituency has altered.
Those of you who were here 20 years ago may remember there were 3 elections in Israel when the system was changed. We had separate votes for the prime minister and for the party, 2 at the same time, and 1 was separate with the prime minister staying, or rather with the prime minister changing. And the idea behind it was, well, they looked at the French system, they looked at the American system, and they found that most polls tended to show that if you voted, say, for a Republican as president or prime minister, you tended to vote for the same party in the party system. So they thought that was a way of reducing the number of parties and giving the prime minister or president more executive power. But of course, we're a Jewish country. What happened in reality was the Jews said, oh, we've got 2 votes, which means we can vote for 2 different things. So I'm going to vote for Bibi as prime minister and for Shas as my religious party. And actually it became even more fragmented. So eventually they went back to the original system.
Right. Thank you. Oh, so there's another question from the same room. Yes.
Roger Morris here. Question. Should we, for those of us who are not registered anymore to vote in UK, and we're told if we do re-register, get back on the voting list, it will not affect our non-domiciled status. Do you think we should be trusting that promise, or are we better off to stay off the list and keep our heads down?
I wasn't aware of that. I've got no idea, to tell you. I've got no idea. Look, in today's world where everything is big brother and every government in the world, America, UK, Israel, can tell you, we don't let people in the police see your tax information and we don't let the Home Office see this information. Come on, we're all aware that these things are linked and interconnected, and when they want to get the data up as you're coming in or out of the country, it's quite easy to do. But if that's what they've said, I would have thought they would have kept to that, because that would be a very important consideration. Because if you're domiciled, then you may have tax issues. If you're non-domiciled, particularly, it's easier for the UK and Israel, which have a reciprocate tax arrangement, than it is for Israel and the USA. But I would have thought they would have kept to that.
Thank you.
Can I just comment on that, because I did international tax, and I would say that I don't think it has an impact on domicile at all. You're actually as a non-resident person, as a non-resident voter. So in your own way, the registration is establishing very firmly that you don't see the UK as your home, and you're not intending to return there. So I don't think it makes any difference. I don't think it will complicate it.
Thanks for that.
But I don't want to be sued if I'm wrong.
Well, by the time he finds out, he can't sue you.
Sorry. Can we mute Collins again? Ed, you've got a question?
Just a more general question. What do you feel about the idea, like in Australia, where voting is compulsory?
Countries like Australia, in a sense, on paper, in theory, it fines you if you don't vote, because they say you have rights and obligations, and you live in a democracy, and therefore not only should you take up the right, but we insist you take it up. And they have a relatively higher percentage, but a lot of people still don't vote. And my understanding is that at the end of the day, not everybody is actually fined, but it does kick up the vote. I think Switzerland as well may have a rule or a law like that. But in a sense, it's coming saying, I'm forcing you to vote. And then you say, well, what sort of a democracy is that? If I don't want to vote, I won't vote. Well, if I want to vote for the crazy loony party, at least they have some humour in the British elections. But I don't think it's practiced in a lot of countries. Australia is one where it is. You can, by the way, in Australia, they insist that you go and vote. So many people still don't, but you can go and vote a blank ballot. But you have to have shown that you voted.
Right. Abby?
Yeah. One other thing, David, I'm very, very pleased to see you after such a long time. One other thing, Avi Linden. Andrew.
Okay, what I wrote to you, is that correct?
Sorry?
I sent you a message on chat. Tell me if it's correct. Okay, afterwards.
I'll have a look at that. And I'll speak to you afterwards about something else anyway. One of the other things that complicates matters that I don't think we necessarily realize is the fact that here in Israel, you've got an identity document, you get your Taudat Zahut, everybody knows who you are and everything else. In England, it's a complete mess. They have no identity documents, and it's impossible for them to know who you are. I know we've had this problem with passports for parents that it's very, very, very difficult to go through and actually show who you are and prove who you are. And it's something I think that complicates matters indeed.
Well, I think, I thought when I grew up in England, I always used to think it was really something that we didn't have to go around with ID documents, that police didn't go around with guns and armor. And the world has changed for the worse since then. So, unfortunately, but clearly an ID, I don't have a basic problem. I mean, I know there was a big discussion in the UK a few years ago about having an ID document, and many people came out and said this negates the basic freedoms of the British people, etc., etc. I mean, I don't go that far. I mean, it's a useful document to have, and I don't see any problem in walking around with one. From that point of view, is it a mess? I don't know. I think the elections are run fairly well in the UK. I don't think there's too much. Every electoral system in the world has a bit of fraud, but I don't think there's too much in Britain. I think it's done quite well. The elections are held very quickly, but it's a bit of a laborious process, sitting down all night and counting the paper ballots. At least that level of computerization, you would have thought they could put in like the old like the old card systems on computers, maybe putting them in. But again, they're also worried that someone's going to tamper with the system and change it around. And of course, it's part of the tradition in the British system, as you know, it's all part of the tradition. I always try to explain to my Israeli students when I taught a course on British politics that, you know, there's something which you may think is weird, quaint, or what they would say, the Israelis would say, what friars? But, you know, people had a certain political culture about the way they did things. You know, so it's very important to stay all night counting and then get on the stage in the morning and with the counting officer. And that's the tradition in Britain. I don't think that's going to change. It's nice, it's quaint, it could be done more efficiently, but I don't think it's too negative either.
Right, right. Okay, right, replied to you, and yeah, you got it right.
Thank you. I think it was Ellie rather than Steve this time, right? Had a question?
Yeah, well, just a couple of things. First of all, the person who said about the non-dom business, I believe that the Labour Party have said they're going to abolish non-dom. That's how they're going to pay for everything.
I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to say is I wanted to echo what somebody in Colin Green's room said about the obligation to vote. That I think that those of us who live in free democratic countries and have the right to vote, we take it very much for granted. We don't realise how many millions of people all over the world don't have that right. And I also think that as a woman, and knowing the history of what women went through in order to persuade men to let them have the vote, I mean, Mrs. Pankhurst would be turning in her grave if she thought that we had the vote and decided not to use it. I've always felt very obligated to vote.
Anyone who's fought for the vote, the same, you know, the interesting thing in America is that, you know, with all the great fight for civil rights and freedom, I mean, there's still to this day, a huge problem under registration of the African community, of the Black community. Correct. And of course, one of the big things that the right wing did for many years after, on paper, the right to vote was given, was they went out of the way to make sure, because you always have to register once in your life to be able to vote, either as a Democrat or as a Republican or as an independent, and they went out of the way to prevent the blacks from actually registering. And again, that's also changed over time. Obviously, groups who have fought to have the right to vote are going to be much less willing to give that right up than people who have been privileged with it from the day they were born.
I just would like to add something to that. I think that Ellie is absolutely right. I've always felt very strongly that I ought to vote because I should exercise my right. But I'm not planning to vote in England because I haven't lived there for 27 years and I don't feel I know enough subjects. And I don't think it's right to only vote on one subject. I'd be voting on the Israel question and that's all. And I don't think that that's appropriate. So I'm not going to.
Warren's got his hand up. Warren's got his hand
up. Val has, and I'm not sure who was first, but I'm going to go for Val to start with and then go back to Warren.
Just to add something you said, if people don't vote and then moan about the government, well, then you think, well, you know, you didn't use your rights and then you can't complain.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you. I have this argument with a lot of my left-wing colleagues in universities and students who in the last few years have given up voting because they say the system has failed us and we only have these right-wingers. And the minute the right-wing government comes in there, but demonstrating and moaning, etc., about issues with which I agree with. Now, I say I'm only prepared to have this discussion with people who voted.
Yeah.
If you didn't vote, you don't have the right afterwards to go out shouting and demonstrating and saying this is not the government we want. I agree with you 100% on that.
Warren?
I was going to take something up again along the point from Joe's point, as Joe was saying about us having the right to vote and using that right, but then because we've lived here we aren't. But is it reasonable as well that people have a right to vote in two different administrations? Is another question.
There used to be something in England where if you were an Oxford or a Cambridge University student, was it you had the right to vote in 2, or you could choose the place you wanted to vote in? I seem to recollect something like that. But there's no reason
you have to choose one of them, but not to
I don't think there's ever been the opportunity of voting in more than one place.
No, but I'm talking voting in Israel and in England.
If you have 2 citizenships, why shouldn't you use them?
And that's you know, I know people with 3 or 4 passports. Maybe they vote in 4 countries.
I think
I don't think, you know, you either have the legal right or you don't have the legal right. That's not what we're discussing. Britain have decided that this is their policy, and therefore people have woken up, and people who in the past didn't vote have woken up to maybe the fact that they may have the right to vote. As I say, everyone has their own considerations. I don't think any are particularly bad considerations or good considerations, but each one of us has different values and different priorities. And we decide to do it as we want.
Any other questions? No.
I think I've tired you enough for one evening.
Yeah, I think we've tired you out probably.
I have something very strange to do with the UK right now, which came up as I was talking to you. I have a niece and a nephew who have been in London for the last 3.5 years who's doing a PhD. They're coming back next week. And today they were packing up a lift. And I have in someone else's house in northwest London a beautiful framed picture, which I didn't want to take out of the frame when I was last in London. I don't know how many of you know the Beverly Jane Stewart paintings of synagogues, but I have one. And I didn't want to take it out. And she suddenly wrote to me just now. She said, if you can get someone to send it to me on Uber tonight, I'll put it in my lift for you. So that's what I've got to go and deal with now when I get on offline.
Okay, we'll let you go then. That's
okay, nice speaking to you all.
Thank you very much.
And please send me the link.
Thank you very much indeed. It was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.